Alright, gang, let's go ahead and get started. It's right about 10 o'clock. We have I think it's Forestry Club meeting. Is that right? Yeah. Coming up, so keep an eye out for that. If you guys are interested in connecting with your classmates and future colleagues all across the country. We are working on some kind of just some more definitional stuff, but also defining what is not what we're after. And we've been talking about tourism at the end of last session's class. Before we get back into that though, does anybody have any announcements, any updates or opportunities for extra credit by going on a trip or volunteering with Park and Wildlife Management in and around Southern Illinois? Yeah.
I think SIF is doing something tomorrow down at Chautauqua Bottoms. Clean up with Green Earth.
Awesome. Yeah. Okay.
Does that count?
Absolutely it does. Yeah. So I'll show you some slides today of people volunteering not at Chautauqua Bottoms but at another Green Earth spot doing exactly what we're talking about and what some trail crews do kind of professionally all year long. So for anybody who can hear that, that is at Chautauqua Bottoms with SAF tomorrow.
Yeah, I think it's at. I don't know how long it'll be there.
Cool. So most trail maintenance is done not really in the spring to prepare for the season, or in early to mid-autumn into winter if you have to do some heavier like tree modification work, so it's a little bit less injurious to the vegetative species involved based on sap flow or storage. And it's also a whole lot nicer doing trail work in autumn weather than it is in summer weather, at least in Southern Illinois. So keep that in mind. That is worth one free extra quiz score over and above like the maximum quiz score you can achieve in class. So even one extra credit opportunity is a great way to just crank up your grade if you're at all worried about it, or if you just like the assurance of having over 100% in the class. We are in the middle of a long-running relationship with Green Earth Incorporated, which is a local not-for-profit. So it's a federally designated 501c3 organization. 501c3 is part of the tax code of the United States, and basically, if you start a company that is less focused on profits than it is providing a public good or a public service, like instead of extracting value for shareholders out of you and me as consumers, the goal of the company is to accomplish something that is more pro-social, like providing green spaces in the town, for example. You can get total tax exemption as that kind of an organization, and anybody who is donating to that organization can get a huge tax break on that donation. So it kind of is one way that the government has tried to incentivize people doing good and also receiving a benefit for doing some good in the form of a tax break. So locally for us, there are lots and lots of 501c3 organizations, and some of those do a ton of essentially charitable work, right? Green Earth is effectively providing parks, and they're not really parks in the sense of like Carbondale City Parks with ball fields and all that stuff. Carbondale City Parks does a great job of that, and they're a part of the local municipal government who do good work. We worked with Carbondale City Parks to plant a food forest a couple years ago, right before the pandemic. It'll take a while for those trees to grow up, but anybody can go get that food for free. So that's an example of a charitable function of either local government in the case of the parks, or in the case of Green Earth, as a local not-for-profit. Another local not-for-profit that you might consider working with, volunteering with this semester, or just because it's a cool thing to do, are the Friends of the Shawnee National Forest. It's another 501c3 not-for-profit organization that does a whole bunch of stuff that the United States Forest Service, in its day-to-day ops of running Shawnee National Forest, Friends of the Shawnee, they do all the stuff that the Forest Service kind of sucks at, like running certain kinds of events, bringing in interesting people to talk and educate both Forest Service staff and like the public curious about how to work a national forest and sort of keep it running. They do like gift shop type operations, right? Most of us in forestry aren't really into like merchandising and stuff like that, but about 10 years ago, I helped set up the Friends of the Shawnee as a 501c3. We put together a list of at least 10,000 or 11,000 different items to just kind of check off and get into the visitor centers. Again, not for the purpose of really making any money. The Friends of the Shawnee National Forest are never gonna really make anybody rich. That's not the point. It's not the goal. The idea is to have a well-curated set of stuff like forest-themed coloring books for little kids in the visitor center, so that kids can grow up understanding that, yeah, forests are cool. Even if you grow up in suburbia or in like downtown Chicago or something like that, people who visit can take a bit of the forest with them in an ecologically sustainable way. If we have a gift shop running, that's fewer incentives for people to take stuff off of the forest, like artifacts, like burl wood, like whatever else. So, yeah, as weird as it sounds, sometimes we get some good forestry work, some land preservation, some archaeological preservation work done in a gift shop, which sounds or feels maybe a little bit indirect, but it absolutely works that way, right? So a lot of people are looking for a memento of their trip. When we get into the history section of this class, we'll talk about kind of how the first concept of America's national parks was, this is a cool spot that's set aside for us as Americans, and since it's mine, I take whatever I want out of it. And so a whole lot of stuff has been taken out of parks and other protected areas over time, to the detriment of everybody, right? We all kind of lose when somebody walks off with an arrowhead or a potsherd or like a bone or a fossil, like bones as of human remains previously interred inside the park and stuff like that. So what I'm talking about with interpretive sales is the human dimension side of forestry, or one part of the human dimension side of forestry, where we're helping to educate people. We're helping people to kind of hear their own permission for being allowed to enjoy their forest. Sometimes people think, oh, well, this probably isn't for me, when it totally is. Like, it's literally for us. So, if you're not a total misanthrope, a hater of humankind, then, as a forester, you can get some really good forestry work done working with people instead of, or maybe in concert with other people working kind of in spite of humans, the ones who like to be out in the forest away from everybody. Okay? So, all that to say, go have a good time with SAF, Society of American Foresters. We're pretty excited about that group of students, and some good connections for you to make and get to like Society of American Foresters regional and national conferences, stuff like that. Have a really good time. There's a lot of job offers at those conferences and stuff like that. So starting that boulder rolling with something like spending a couple hours from like 3 to 5 or whatever, helping with volunteering in a trail, that can lead to some connections in SAF, where somebody has the opportunity to encourage you to go to like the SAF national meeting. It moves around all over the country, and it's thousands of foresters who want to hire you, who are desperate to hire you because there are so many forestry jobs and like this many forestry programs and this many forestry students in them. So it's a good day to be a forestry student. Go hang out at Chautauqua Bottoms, which is just right outside campus this way. Chautauqua is the road running off of campus westward towards Murfreesboro this way, for those of you who are new to town. All right, so, man, that was 10 minutes of introduction. Let's get back into some what Forest Rec kind of is, what we're concerned with, what we're working our butts off to manage, and then some good and not so good examples of or some positive and not so positive examples of what we're not really intending to be working with. Now, sometimes if we get somebody like a pretty cowboy tour operator, a heli tour operator who is looking at turning some rotors and making some money as a tour provider, sometimes somebody like that becomes your problem as the forester if they are, for example, accepting a lot of money from their clients to buzz herds of wildlife like your elk, your caribou, reindeer, your muley deer, your black-tailed, white-tailed deer, whatever, bison. It is really, really, really easy to stampede those herds off of cliffs or to cause a lot of injuries among the calves, the young yearlings of those herds, when all of them are running in a panic away from a helicopter like this. So we gotta deal with that as wildlife habitat managers, right? That helicopter is transgressing into that core habitat space and causing a panic stampede, and they'll literally run right off a cliff, right? This was one Native American hunting technique back in the day. They did it because it worked. But unfortunately, our helicopters are really, really, really good at causing those kinds of stampedes, and they work way too well. A little hex or quad drone is really, really good at causing a panic stampede. And consumer-grade recreation drones are flat out banned at all national parks these days because it just takes one idiot to ruin a decade or more of difficult, expensive, and without success guaranteed breeding efforts to repopulate American bison across our landscape, right? Cause one panic stampede and kill off most of a herd, that's a problem. So, sometimes we are dealing with folks when we, shouldn't have to be, but they just sort of bring the problem to our doorstep and stuff like that. But, strictly speaking, we are not directly interfacing with heli tourism operators or other kinds of like boat tourism operators. But the National Park Service, in its fragile coastal ecosystems, for example, absolutely tightly regulates this stuff. So, like in Cumberland Island National Seashores, this beautiful multiple mile long wilderness island off the coast of southern Georgia, right north of the Florida-Georgia line. And it's just off the coast of St. Mary's, Georgia, for those of you who know southeast Georgia. And it's pine timber country down there, live oak country. The might of the British fleet in the 1700s was built out of those live oaks, for example. And Cumberland Island is a beautiful barrier island, so it's a long, skinny string of sand. And it used to be a plantation island back in the bad old days. And there's there's a bunch of historic buildings and ruins there of enslaved people, living quarters, and the stereotype of the southern slave or plantation kind of thing. Dungeness is the ruin of that mansion. It's not even just a mansion, it's like a mansion complex, okay? They were living pretty fat on Cumberland Island on the backs of human labor back in the day. To the point that, the Kennedys, the American political dynasty, the Kennedys, a couple of the Kennedys got married at Dungeness before it burned down. This is Kardashian tier celebrity before there were Kardashians. And Dungeness was one of the spots that they were doing their thing. So, when the United States National Park Service took over that entire island and it was designated as a wilderness area, the National Park Service curates all of those ruins and all of the really amazing and beautiful and fragile barrier island ecosystem members and structures and functions, including the feral horses, which stampeded through our tent site one night. That was pretty intense. Summer camp that year. So if you're planning on going on summer camp in 2024, let's have a conversation about whether you want to go to the southeast and get stampeded by feral horses that are left over on the island from back in the 1800s days, water around Cumberland Island National Seashore is a really pretty fragile ecosystem. Barrier islands have a crucial function for protecting shorelines from erosion or encroachment, and they just anchor, just millions and millions of cubic meters of soil around each one as the sand sediment. And people in open two-stroke engine, like outboard motor fishing boats around these islands can kind of swarm places like Cumberland Island Seashore, because the only way onto or off of this island these days is a single Park Service commissioned ferry. And if you're not on that boat, you're not getting onto the island. And if you're not using that boat, you're not getting off the island either. So these tickets are expensive. They sell out months in advance. And if you have your own boat, you could just kind of ignore all of that hassle. Like, geez, I didn't know that I had to, kiss my loved one Happy New Year, and then immediately jump on the Park Service website to get a ticket for that ferry if I wanted to go anytime in the next 12 months. If you don't know that and you have a boat, well, you got a hammer. Everything looks like a nail, right? So you can take your private boat to Cumberland Island National Seashore. The problem is the engines on these boats, two-stroke engines in particular, they're real dirty. They're burning gasoline and oil together, and they're leaking that stuff all over the place, low-key. And as it turns out, it doesn't take a ton of these boats to start killing off that critical shore vegetation that is, breeding habitat for basically everything. So the Park Service shut that down. They said this is a wilderness area, and in order to preserve its wilderness character, both for human use and for the ecological function of this place, you cannot operate a two-stroke engine watercraft within X hundreds of meters of this particular shoreline. Now, there's also a major United States Navy submarine facility real close by, so maybe you don't want to be wandering around there without a good plan in the first place. But it's a thing. We have to sometimes worry about or figure out, what is this encroachment doing to us? What's it doing to where we are trying to manage? And how do we need to respond to that? So sometimes, all that to say, even if we're not sort of primarily concerned with this stuff, we're still being vigilant about it, because boat owners, tour operators, helicopter owners, they have every incentive and motivation to do this stuff. We're managing the most beautiful spots on Earth. So, tourism is not wrecked. Sometimes we are dealing with managing tourism. Tourism isn't forest wreck. If you are thinking about going to a water park and just sort of having all of your needs and safety risks kind of managed by somebody else, go to a water park. That's tourism. The Park Service doesn't typically staff beaches with lifeguards. This is a swim at your own risk kind of a thing all over the place, because there's just too many places to swim. And once you start putting out lifeguards, then the expectation, and a reasonable expectation, becomes, well, there's going to be somebody to bail me out if I get in literally over my head. Okay. So, the Park Service made a choice in the middle of the previous century to shift from a service mindset to a personal responsibility mindset of, we're not here to put out a bunch of trash cans at every trailhead and every campsite and all of this. Instead, we're going to help you and everybody else understand, hey, if you're here in these places, you gotta be responsible for yourself. If you poop in some of these places where the poop is not going to degrade and get turned into soil nutrients rapidly, then pack it out. As unpleasant as that is, we're not here to wipe your butt for you. Okay? So, that's a good thing for us as foresters, because I don't know. My wife and I decided not to have kids, so wiping butt's not really my jam. Anyway, moving on. So yeah, most tourism is just not forest rec. So here's another example for here. So let's think about this for a second. Somebody thought it was the value add to this beautiful natural space to create basically a synthetic stream, if you want to think of it, on a cliff face, with lots and lots and lots and lots of polycarbonate and metal and drilling and blasting. And a whole lot, typically, of gas being burned to power the pumps to make sure that this tourist operation has a regulated water supply. Does this make sense? So we're creating a synthetic version of an ecosystem service, if you want to think of it. A stream provides a whole bunch of ecosystem services. And a stream with a couple of cubic feet per second flow and a very smooth, very hard, rigid bottom is pretty okay for high speed, low friction entertainment like this. This is not outdoor recreation. This is like sitting in an inflated seat and sliding forward, you know? Like it's not, strictly speaking, active, which is a key component of recreation. This isn't biomechanically any different than strapping a VR headset on, maybe your Oculus if you're a VR dork like I am, and sitting on your couch and doing this virtually, right? Your body's not doing much different out here versus on that couch. So, this is not forest and outdoor recreation. This is straight up tourism, and this system has a service life. Eventually it's going to get kind of rusted or a little bit busted. If any one of those polycarbonate or glass panels is broken, the whole system stops working. Does that make sense? Okay. That's how we have a high-speed come apart of human bodies. So just like at a very tourism-centric place like a Six Flags, something like that. Everybody ever been to a Six Flags or on a roller coaster? Yeah. This is no different than a roller coaster. It's just in a natural place. So when you are signing up to be a park ranger, you're not signing up to be in charge of something like this. Okay? Now, again, there's nothing sort of inherently wrong or evil or good or bad about running adventure tourism stuff like this. It's just not forestry. Okay? We have whole other majors for this. So the Outdoor Recreation Program speaks a little bit to this. The Hospitality and Tourism Administration major speaks very directly to this. How do you curate stuff like this? Okay? So, being in a natural place, like a mountain pass, as right here, doesn't make it forest or outdoor recreation at all. It's just a fun thing to do that happens to be in a natural place. So, people bring a lot of money, they spend the money, they go away. What this is tapping into, though, is the same as what most kinds of forest and outdoor recreation are tapping into. So, it can be a little bit confusing for folks who come to a place like Mammoth Cave, and they end up doing a whole bunch of stuff in Cave City, which is a tourism gateway community, as it's called, right outside of Mammoth Cave National Park, and they do a bunch of, like, caves with laser light shows because the cave somehow isn't exciting enough on its own. They do stuff like zip lines through caves because the joy of movement is a very, very deeply wired in our hindbrains kind of a thing. It is satisfying, it is good, it feels good when we are moving. And so when we put people in an unusual situation and ask them to move through it, as on a ropes course, a challenge course, a sky bridge like this, it feels very cool. It's engaging. You're making a lot of memories. You are definitely awake instead of kind of feeling heavy-lidded, here in a classroom setting because we're not really moving. So, this is not forest and outdoor recreation. All right, so we'll get into some other classes of things that are not what we are concerned with this semester. Now, let's talk about a few pastimes, for example. So, passing the time outside is not forest and outdoor recreation automatically. Right? So this is by some trees, but it's not in a forest. Make sense? Okay. So, this is not anymore something that you need to primarily worry about managing as a park ranger any more than standing in your garage makes you a car. Alright? So, the way that we differentiate pastimes from forest recreation is the question, is this resource dependent? Does this depend on the presence of a natural cliff line or a forest ecosystem or anything like that? Or if we install this equipment anywhere else, arbitrarily on the face of the planet, we could still do this. If we can still do this anywhere else, then it's sport, it's pastime, it's something not forest recreation. Make sense? All right. Let's see. So let's talk about some sports. These days, with the advent of social media, we have a bazillion videos like this one. People doing stuff that sometimes involves movement, sometimes involves being outside, but it's all for the purpose of being captured on video for clout. And as you guys are the first generation to grow up with smartphones, this is more deeply embedded in your awareness than in my generations, for example, or anybody for the last couple of 100,000 years of modern humanity that has ever existed before. Okay? So there's this sense of, okay, sports are fun, and sometimes they're in quasi-natural spaces, but there are, again, other majors for stuff like turf management for sporting facilities. This is not forestry, although it is forestry adjacent. This has a lot to do with watershed quality or harm to watershed quality done wrong. Okay? So, golf is a walk outside that is kind of ruined, as the old quote suggests. Right? Forest rec, not sports, because the rec is divorced from, it is homogenized or standardized from the peculiar and unique and outstanding factors that are natural for that space. Stuff like rally car racing is, I'm not sure if this is a picture or video, nope, just a picture. Rally car racing is where you drive like Subaru WRXs, heavily modified, down gravel roads like this, and potentially on the Shawnee, for example, if they were decided to do one, at up to 110, 120 miles an hour. If you're familiar with the, was it Isle of Skye motocross marathon? It's like the deadliest motorcycle race in the world. It's basically some of this and some like little town roads on this tiny little island just rocketing around, and people just fly off and get splattered. And it's pretty cool. It's a lot of fun to be a rally car driver or their co-driver, the person with the binder, calling out left to tight closing to say, hey, this is a really sharp left-hand turn, and the turn radius gets tighter as you go through it, so we need to dump some speed on this uphill coming up to it. It's nuts. It's absolutely crazy. So if you ever see like a hatchback flying through the air and trees in the background, it's probably a photo or a video from a rally race. Those often happen on national forests, but it's not forest and outdoor recreation, it's a sporting event because it's not strictly about that forest, it's about driving real fast, and it happens to take place in forests because this would be super deadly in an urban setting. That doesn't stop some people. All right. Indoor climbing walls, obviously not forced and outdoor recreation. Exercise by itself, not recreation. It is some of the same benefits, but again, has nothing to do with the outdoors in most cases. So, there's a lot of stuff that is forest and outdoor rec adjacent. Like if you get your hands on a minigun and you have lots and lots and lots of money. This is a looping cinematograph. This guy doesn't actually have this much money, right? These things are like $1 million a minute to fire a full-on Vulcan cannon. This is outdoors. And it's recreational for some people. But again, this isn't really about the particular forest. This is about a piece of equipment that you just need some space for, to send things downrange and go kinetic and so forth. Okay? So, for those of you who are Gunnet fans or watch any of like the Warrior Poet YouTube channels and stuff like that, very, very commonly the backdrop for those videos is set in a forested environment because you need some kind of a backdrop, right? You need a safe backstop to shoot into. But again, we're not necessarily, as park rangers, thinking this is what our parks are for. So if you go to a national park and you are a gun enthusiast, which is a very common thing among Americans, you might be able to do in certain specific areas some kinds of forest recreation shooting, like plinking, for example, which is walking around looking for arbitrary targets that are safe and shooting at them to see if you can hit them. Plinking. But extractive things like hunting are typically not permitted in parks because that's not consistent with preservation. Now, conservation on a national forest, absolutely, lots of hunting. A lot of wilderness areas where primitive uses of the land, like hunting is about as primitive potentially as it gets, right? I mean, this is how people put food on the, before we had tables, maybe people ate on tree stumps, I don't know. Put food on the stump, whatever. So that's okay in a wilderness area. But in a park where recreation is the function of preservation practices, not so much the thing, okay? So, it gets weird with firearms. We have such a weird Byzantine mess of laws and different states and stuff like this, and just people have very strong opinions about guns. It gets nuts. I'm only bringing up miniguns and stuff like that because clearly somebody's doing it for capture on social media, and because one of my previous grad students, a guy named CJ, who works in Washington State Parks, called me up one day and said, "Dr. Park, I just gotta tell you, it's an exciting day to be a park ranger. I'm dealing with some folks who are cutting down trees by shooting at them in our state park." So people pull up on this gravel road, like way out from the back corner of the park, where nobody can see them, and they shoot enough bullets at full-size mature trees that the trees fall over. Like, do you know how many times you have to shoot a tree for it to fall over? They're like the end bosses on zombie survival games, just like bullet sponges. It's a lot. But somebody had the money and the inclination that this is fun, this is worth doing. Maybe just to see if I can do it, okay? So that's a thing. That's another example of that state park not really being for high velocity lumbering, but one or more of your visitors are kind of bringing that activity into the park, and so by golly, you're going to be managing that one way or another. Yeah, that's a thing. So, there's a lot of types of leisure. Not all of them map onto forest and outdoor rec. It's a much more specific subspecies of the thing. Speaking of subspecies of forest rec, we've got wildland. So that's wilderness recreation. Okay, when I say a wildland rec in this, and when your other professors say wildland rec, we're talking about there are no street lamps along the trails, there are no flush toilets, there are probably not paved roads in federally designated wilderness when state designated wilderness is mostly. There will not be any paved roads, there will not be any permanent human structures like buildings or outhouses, or even bridges. Something. Wildland means something very specific, and that specification is kind of caught up in the word primitive that we've seen before. So, whatever the most primitive form of the recreation is, that's what's allowed and that's what is encouraged and managed toward in wildland recreation. So, this means that, for example, in federally designated wildernesses, like the 6 wilderness areas on the Shawnee National Forest, we have no mountain bikes. Because bicycles are not primitive. They're mechanical devices that, through pulleys and levers, like the pedal arms and stuff like that, transform your biomechanical effort into motion. And mechanized stuff, like bikes, not okay in federally designated wilderness areas. Also not okay in federally designated wilderness areas, chainsaws. Because there's a more primitive version of the saw, the hand saw, or the buck saw, or a hacksaw if you're cutting metal for some reason, and so on and so forth. So, trail work, campsite maintenance work, all that stuff is done by hand. You can't even bring a cart into the wilderness to carry your tools in a lot of cases, because wheels are high technology, and there are more primitive versions or ways to get heavy crap like your tools 70 miles down the trail to work on that section of trail versus a wheel, which is, I don't know, 6,000 to 8,000 years old maybe more. Like with the cart people who spoke Indo-European somewhere around Anatolia 8,000 years ago. That's too modern. So we use horses and mules to pack tools in when you're on a National Park Service trail crew or a Forest Service trail crew working in wilderness. You can bring that stuff in by hand, or you can have a pack animal, which started to be domesticated around maybe 10,000 years ago, and for whatever reason, Congress thinks 10,000 year ago technology is okay. Wheels, not okay. Stuff like GPSs, okay, because it's not mechanical, it's electronic, yeah? So, the Wilderness Act was written in 1964 before we had personal, portable, microelectronic devices, and now these days, with like the new iPhone 15 is what, a 3-nanometer silicon process? The circuit wiring on the iPhone is 13 atoms wide. That's nanotechnological. That's pretty fancy, okay? Congress had no idea the iPhone was coming back in 1964, so they didn't write the Wilderness Act to exclude high technology stuff like smartphones. But your bicycle, no sir. All right? This is how laws go. So, we have wildland recreation. It is explicitly primitive. It is explicitly restricted to a really pretty narrow and early on subset of tools. Now we back those tools with extremely advanced geosciences, soil science, physics. Part of my research is to figure out how to construct trails to be maximally sustainable. And there's a ton of science that goes into it so that when you are swinging that shovel, you're getting the absolute maximum value and benefit out of that literal sweat equity that you're putting into cutting that section of trail. Okay? So wildland management is extremely sophisticated, but the on-the-ground work can feel like, man, this is not really that different from when folks were building the pyramids way back in the day, or if the aliens were doing it for them, I don't know, with tractor beams. But anyway, it's this weird amalgam of extreme high technology and research with hand tools like Pulaski's and pick mattocks and council rakes and all that stuff. Another kind of subtype or subspecies of forest and outdoor recreation that is at the opposite end of the spectrum, we'd call this urban proximate or urban recreation. Okay, so the Park Service is not really into running skate parks, for example. That's more of a local thing. But these days, because almost everybody is living in at least a suburban or more dense setting, you know, a bunch of us are from Chicagoland, right? They figured out a lot of people are going almost all of their lives not going to national parks because they're just really far away and they're just expensive to get to, and you have a bunch of time and ain't got no time for that, right? So we're busy taking classes and working and getting sick, eating junk food and stuff like that. So part of the move has been to kind of surface this stuff and make sure that everybody has decent access ideally within walking distance, right? Like, not everybody has a car. Not everybody wants a car. Not everybody can afford a car. So, to the extent that we could get forested spaces for outdoor recreation present in, like, empty lots, or transform, re-landscape some urban parks into urban wild spaces, actually urban green spaces, well, then we could do some good work. We could transform those chunks of the planet into sort of a green earth, if you will, and maybe run those as not-for-profits inside city limits, like Green Earth does here in Carbondale. The next kind of flavor of forest recreation that we are interested in managing beyond wildland and urban rec is going to be adventure recreation. Okay? So, any of you guys or gals heard of Scouts? All right, how about Venture Crew? Okay, still a few people. How about Outward Bound? All right, for those of you who are familiar with Venture Crew or Outward Bound, how would you sort of explain those to somebody in a couple of sentences, maybe?
Venture Crew is kind of what like the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts funnel into. It's like a college age scouting.
Yeah, pretty much. Okay, so you go and do trips. Maybe you go whitewater rafting, or you go backpacking for a week, or what have you. It's pretty cool. It's kind of like a co-ed advanced version of what Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts used to be back when they were more separated organizations. And then Outward Bound is kind of a bounding leap past Venture Crew, where it's not a continuously associated group of folks like a scout troop, for example. It's more folks who are going on a specific trip, and it might be anywhere from 3 weeks to 3 months long. And so one buddy of mine went on an Outward Bound trip and in high school, and the move was over the summer to go out west to a beautiful area of northern Colorado, southern Wyoming, wide open, lots of elk habitat, stuff like that, and learn how to camp and stuff like that. And it was kind of a flatlander, gringo, flat-footer. So learn how to backpack, do your own tenting, stuff like that, but also learn to forage for food and purify your own water. And then the culmination of that 3-week-long trip is to head out for 3 days, and they give you, I think it's like 3 matches and a water bottle and maybe a hatchet, something like that, or like a fixed blade knife. And then for 3 days, you go and you build your shelter and you purify your water and everything else. Okay? So that's adventure recreation. That's a little bit different than walking your dog in a green space here in Carbondale. And it is something that our national parks, and in particular our wilderness areas, do often like handle, countenance, welcome people in for. And something like that, it needs a different kind of support. So stuff like that's going to be done under what's called a special use permit. Those folks showing up to go camping for a couple of days at a campground, we got that covered. Those folks going backpacking for a week in Shawnee National Forest along the River to River Trail or something like that, we got that covered. Somebody's going to be out for 3 months and then do survivalism stuff solo at the end of that 3 months. That's probably pretty different. We may need to check on the Outward Bound organizations, like the trip leaders certifications. Does this person have wilderness first aid or wilderness first responder, so that if or when something goes wrong with any of their campers, their adventure campers, they know what to do and they have the proper first aid kit for it, maybe a Stokes litter, which is like a medical litter you'd see getting pushed towards an ambulance, but it's got one mountain bike tire on it. That's how you exfiltrate people who are non-ambulatory down a trail. Stokes litter. Stuff like that. So adventure recreation is like camping and hiking or horseback riding, or they do adventure rec trips where you're sea kayaking down the coast of Chile or something like that. It's a lot. It's pretty cool. But it's also not for everybody. Another kind of recreation that is not for everybody is risk-oriented recreation. So we call this like adrenaline rec. Most of us think of when I say the phrase rock climbing, for example. It's a pretty slow speed thing with lots of protective equipment, with weird names, and funny sounding names of the pitches or climbs, and sort of the insider vocabulary of like, send the crux of the problem on this multi-pitch, bruh. And like, people know what some of that means, and then, that's a nice afternoon on the wall. Risk-oriented stuff is for any particular activity, not just rock climbing. The whole point is to push the envelope, push out past the edge of what people think is possible or reasonable or sane, and just see how it goes. So, for example, there were a bunch of people getting into base jumping into the 90s and 2000s. Base jumping is where you have basically a wingsuit, so you've got kind of sailcloth material or spinnaker nylon in between your wrist and your ankle to model or biomimic the patagia, or the skin flaps of flying squirrels or sugar gliders. You guys know what those are? All right, so you get into this funny looking suit, strap on a parachute, and crucially, for a lot of these, we're not going without the GoPro.
Yeah.
And hit record and jump off a cliff or a bridge or a radio tower, like a transmission tower or something like that. Anything that's really high relative to the landscape around it. The lip of a ford, like a fjord, U-shape, glacial spill valley. And you just jump and you glide up to a couple of 100 miles an hour, and then at the bottom you pop the chute and try to land away from the law enforcement rangers that are spot scoping you and trying to catch you, because this is not always something that the parks are sort of geared for. To get up to those cliff ledges, sometimes some base jumpers have trampled through all kinds of like legally protected, like rare, threatened, or endangered kinds of vegetation, or disturbed peregrine falcon habitat, which is critically tied to and unavoidably tied to cliff edges, for example. And every once in a while, it doesn't go well. So there's a base jumper named Dean Potter who did exactly this at, I think it was off of one of the big walls at Yosemite. So a couple of 1,000-foot drop, and you can sail for a couple of miles. And he skimmed a ridge a little bit too close, and his last moments were caught on his GoPro and published online. And it's a pretty horrifying video to watch. Like, this is somebody's life ending in the pursuit of forced and outdoor recreation. So sometimes risk is the point for some people. Zane.
Couldn't risk recreation be considered a subset of adventure recreation?
Yes and no. The psychology of it is actually pretty different when you peel back the why of why people are doing it. For venture recreation, it tends to be about sort of character and skill and personal development. And for risk recreation, it is the thrill kill cult, to borrow the band name. Okay? Cool. All right, let's end it right there, and we'll talk about a couple of inherent attributes of outdoor rec next time. However, as you're packing up, keep on packing up. Class is canceled for Thursday. Class is also canceled for Tuesday. I have to go travel out of state, so I'm not going to be available. I'll make sure that all of this stuff is online, so you can peruse this stuff. We've been posting our videos, class recordings, and the PowerPoints and all that. But our next 2 class sessions are canceled. I'll be back on Wednesday of next week, so I'll see you a week from this Thursday. Make sense?
Yeah.
All right, cool. See you then. Enjoy a couple days off.